Hi everybody, in this presentation I'm going to talk about how I use learning commentaries, both in Science Ed 201 and in 204, the chemistry class. And the reason that I'm including 204 is because I think of these learning commentaries as building from each other over time and adding complexity. So learning commentaries are metacognitive writing activities for the students. I assign them around quiz time, usually they're due before the quiz so that they provide an opportunity for students to review before the quiz. And they have specific prompts, which I will show you in a moment, but I'm going to give you just kind of an overview of how they work. Basically, they ask the student to choose an idea that they think has changed as a result of class activities or they've added to as a result of class activities, and to write about that experience. In the first learning commentary, that is the focus. That's all that the prompts are asking them to do. In the second one, I add a prompt where they respond to the 3 key findings of how people learn, which I ask them to read as part of this assignment. And think about how their discussion of their learning experience relates to at least one of the 3 key findings and how people learn. In the third learning commentary, I ask them to read Effective Science Instruction by Eric Banelauer and then comment on implications for their teaching, in parallel with the how people learn 3 key findings and also related to their personal metacognition, which they still do, the thinking about their thinking part. When it comes to 204, I add a little bit of complexity to that. And one of those is in the form of 2 different options, and you'll see these when I come to the prompts. I think that by adding that option, it adds some choice and it adds a chance to be a little bit more authentic instead of just doing what I ask them to do. So that was my thinking about that, and I think that it worked pretty well last time I used it. I have a prompt that at the end of these learning commentaries in Science Ed 204 that ask them to look at the different dimensions of the next generation science standards. So I start with the disciplinary core ideas and have them look up a disciplinary core idea that relates to the content that they had been learning. So in each of these commentaries for 204, I give them those 2 options, thinking about their thinking or thinking about common student ideas, and then another dimension of the NGSS. So for the second one, it's scientific practices, and for the third one, it's cross-cutting concepts. For the scientific practices one, they are asked to write about a practice that they think that they engaged in the class that led to a change in their thinking or that relate to these common student ideas. And for cross-cutting concepts, what I do is I ask them to think about a concept that they learned in Science Ed 201 or in 202 or 203 if they took one of those 2 courses, and that is represented in 204 to give them practice in seeing the bigger picture scientific ideas that cut across all of these classes. And those are really kind of fascinating to read. So I definitely think that it's worthwhile to, for me anyway, to add these NGSS components to the end of the learning commentaries. I think that they afford a chance for the students to begin exploring the NGSS, and I hope that that leads into a baseline understanding of what the NGSS are all about and how they're different from old standards once they get to their methods classes. So I'm going to show you now some specific prompts. You have these on a handout. So learning commentary 1 for 201 is shown here. Basically, they choose and clearly identify something that I call a consensus idea from class. So when I teach my 20X classes, I always end each activity with with what I call a consensus idea discussion, where I ask students in small groups to identify 2 to 3 big ideas that they thought the activity had developed and that they had developed some evidence for. And I call those, and we write those up on the board. I usually help them with phrasing, and I ask them questions if not everything that I think is represented should be represented, or not everything that I think should be represented is represented. But basically, we end each activity with a list of consensus ideas on the front whiteboard that they then write in their packet. And so this stands in for the scientists' ideas before they get them. So they have to choose and clearly identify one consensus idea. Then they describe their initial understanding of that idea, and they have to cite evidence from their workbook as support for that. So evidence from their workbook is some answer to an initial ideas question, for example. And then they describe what their final understanding was, and then highlight how it's different from their initial understanding. And again, they have to cite evidence from their workbook that they now have this idea. The most common thing that I take off points for in this learning commentary is the evidence piece. I think that students sometimes mistake evidence of their thinking for evidence of the idea, and I try to make it really, really clear to them what I mean by that from their first learning commentary, and give them feedback. And if they really don't understand, if it's really clear that they didn't understand the assignment, I give them a chance to redo it. And then finally, they discussed what caused or led to the changes they described that came from class. So what class activity they did that and how it helped them change their idea. Okay, so learning commentary 2 in 201 is still thinking about their thinking first, but then I add this 5th prompt. So prompts 1 through 4 are still the same. And then I add this 5th prompt that has them discuss how the learning that they described above relates to one or more of the 3 key findings, which I tell them to read at the beginning of this assignment. And I link to the online version of How People Learn. These are all screenshots, by the way, and I'm happy to share the actual assignments from Canvas because they all have hyperlinks in them. And then this 3rd learning commentary, which would come around final quiz time, the first prompts are, again, the same. Let me see something here. Okay, I didn't notice this before, but the first, number 1 in learning commentary 2 is this one right here. So I just didn't give it a number. And so that would make this one number 2 and so forth. Okay, so still the same prompts, but then I have a different ending prompt that then asks them to relate their learning experience to the elements of effective science instruction that are in the effective science instruction paper that they read. It looks like last time I did this prompt, I had them read that effective science instruction paper as its own separate assignment. I think that I got that idea from Sue, actually. So Sue could probably tell you more about it. And then I referenced it here. I actually did not use this assignment last time I taught 201 because I used a set of writing prompts that I was wanting to pilot for my research project instead. But I would definitely do this one again. I think that it's really worthwhile to do. So I'll show you then what I use for 204. So in 204, we have the 2 options here, and it outlines them. This is, I know, hard to see probably on the screen, but you have the handout. So you have the options A and B, and they're discussed here. Each part of this learning commentary has a different prompt for option A or option B. For this option 2, you describe your initial understanding for for option A, or you conduct an internet search to identify at least one common idea children might have related to whatever consensus idea they identified up here. So identifying a consensus idea is always the first step. Okay, and then you can see how option A and option B kind of flow from that. Either they discuss how their understanding of the concept changes, or they discuss why the idea that was discussed up here in number 2 might make sense to the student. In the fourth step, either they discuss the classroom experience that led them to change their idea, or they discuss the type of learning experience that might help a student change their idea. And then number 5 is where I have them explore the NGSS. So this is the prompt that's asking them to examine the disciplinary core idea section, and they have to choose one that they think is related to the content that they did up until now. And these bulleted directions are just telling them how to do that. Okay, so learning commentary 2, again, option A and option B are the same, but now for number 5, they are looking at the practices. And for that, I have them read a part of the framework. I just think that they're better compiled in the framework for K-12 science education than on the NGSS website. And so they have to choose one of those scientific practices that they think they engaged in during the learning experience that they described above. And you'll see some specific prompts related to that. Finally, for the cross-cutting concepts piece, again, options A and option B are the same, but now they do cross-cutting concepts. So they look at the cross-cutting concepts, and the prompt there is more related to multiple classes than it is to this specific class. Remember, we're talking about 204 right now. So they are thinking about other courses they've taken. All of them will have taken 201, so we know that they can discuss cross-cutting concepts between 201 and 204. But some of them might choose one or both of these classes, so they can choose more than one of those from that list. And then they discuss how the concept connects some of the content or discuss how the cross-cutting concepts from one or more of those classes show up again in the chemistry class 204. So if anybody wanted to adopt this, say for 202 or 203, then you would just change the language about which class they're making connections to. So that's it. As I said, I find especially this last one really, really fascinating to read, and I almost want to do a research project about it because it's interesting to see what students see as the kind of unifying ideas between these classes. And similarly, though, I think that it's really interesting to see what they see in terms of the disciplinary core ideas and the practices. And I find them really fun and rewarding to read overall because they do, it is a chance to reflect, and I would say more often than not, they do that in an authentic way. I definitely can say that there are people who kind of do it as a rote exercise, and I don't think that we can change that no matter how hard we change these prompts or fool around with them. But the ones that engage in these authentically, which I think is most of them, give me really good information about how their thinking is changing, and they're just really fascinating to read. So that's it. Let me know if you have other questions about these. Like I said, I would be more than happy to share the assignments themselves so that you have to do minimal adaptation or no adaptation.